Welcome to the Silicon Slopes podcast. Today I'm joined by Rob Etherington, who's the president and CEO of Clene. How are you?
Fantastic. Thanks for inviting us.
You bet. So this is a good one. You guys are doing a lot of very cool things. Let the listeners know what you guys do and what your purpose is there.
So Clene is a clinical stage biopharmaceutical company. Effectively, that means we're in clinical trials now that read out all within the next 18 months or so. And if we are successful, we will change the way that important neurodegenerative diseases such as ALS, multiple sclerosis, and Parkinson's are treated. And we've been on this journey, even an adventure, for about 8 years. And it's fun to see it come close to fruition. Pharmaceutical drug development is like that, a long process. And then you get to the end and you unblind your data and you find out if you can help patients, people with these horrible, devastating diseases, or whether you can't. And we'll find that out in the next 18 months in a series of catalyst events.
Okay. So that 18 months is important in your company and the industry as a whole.
Yes, for two reasons. We have a number of clinical studies, and any one of them would be a great success. If all 4 of them read out positive, then it will be frankly remarkable and a great blessing to people who live with these diseases.
Yeah. And what does a clinical study entail for the drug you guys are working on?
So just a quick little primer for your listeners who may be less familiar with pharmaceutical drug development. So first of all, one finds an asset, takes that asset into preclinical investigative work with animal models, and one works through a number of species, as we did. Took us 5.5 years of preclinical animal models in a whole host of, in our case, models of remyelination and neurodegeneration, which is basically the way our central nervous systems work, talk to our muscles, whether or not they effectively talk, and how signals commute from our brain down to whatever muscle we need to command. And after that preclinical investigative work, in a series of preclinical models, one moves to phase 1 studies. Those are in healthy human subjects, and you want to verify safety and toxicity. Your drug is not doing any complicated untoward damage in patients, human subjects. And then you move to phase 2, which are called proof of concept studies. Then you move to phase 3, which are called registration studies, which means that they're registration eligible for FDA approval. And then you take all that package and you submit it to the FDA, and they approve the drug. And given this week that we're just talking about a Pfizer vaccine approval, that exact same process happened in a very accelerated way in this last year. So all of your listeners will be very familiar with this. Pfizer had developed vaccines that they then quickly took into this range of, in this case, the vaccination COVID case, a series of accelerated experimental clinical studies that then proved out, and the FDA approved the drug.
All right. So it's not for the faint of heart.
No, it's a very expensive, long, arduous, technically difficult and demanding process.
Yeah.
But if one is successful, and biopharmaceuticals have been successful over now many decades, most of the last century, has created a lot of value for investors, a lot of job opportunities for people in towns across this world, and frankly, most importantly, therapies that you and I take to keep us healthy.
Yeah. Yeah. And when they hit, to your point, like the investors are happy, but then it also impacts a lot of people's health.
A lot. In fact, that was a key inspiration for me. I was in grad school and realized that in business one could do a lot of things, and biopharmaceutical healthcare development beckoned because it's an opportunity to use one skill set to accomplish something that has a major impact if we're successful on people's lives. And so I've been doing this for now nearly 30 years.
Yeah. And there's usually not a lot of luck that goes into it, right? Like it takes a while, and you got to prove.
The number of drugs that fail across all of these sequenced phases is an extraordinary high number. So to your point of faint of heart, it is a high risk and high reward endeavor if one is successful. And there's a lot of factors that feed into the success. The drug must work. One must design the studies correctly. One must have the proper interface with the clinicians, the academicians, the experts in scientific drug development across the world that assist you, and then taken all together, patients that come into the clinical studies and investors that are willing to pay for this long journey.
Yeah. All right. So we were talking real quick before we jumped in here. You'll lose to your kids in a swimming contest, and you'll easily beat your mom in a running contest, right?
The point I was making is that all of us slow down as we age. It's an inevitable fact of life, and Clene in particular is very focused on that. So I have a senior in high school that just graduated and just took all state in a couple competitions in the swimming pool. I swim as well. She swims extraordinarily better than me because A, she's more trained, and B, she's younger. Mm-hmm. But then in contrast, my mother, who's also a swimmer, who's now 77, I can beat her in the swimming pool quite appreciably. I can beat her walking down the street.
Right.
So why is that the case? My daughter that I was speaking of is 18. My mother's 77. I'm 55. All of us have different levels of energy in our bodies that we can lever and that we can leverage. And if we all slow down in our consecutive decades, and you're not surprised by this, all of us know that as we age, we get slower. Then the question that Clene asks is, can we influence the course of these neurodegenerative diseases where you and I and the whole human family slow down every decade? And in particular, we're focused on the neurodegenerative diseases of energetic failure.
Like
multiple sclerosis, like ALS, like Parkinson's disease. And there's a whole number of others that we have not yet tackled. But if we're successful in this first thesis of ALS, multiple sclerosis, and Parkinson's, and ALS is often called Lou Gehrig's disease historically, not so much anymore. Its scientific name is amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, but is a devastating diagnosis that, though rare, affects people's lives in extraordinarily devastating ways. And so Clene's intent is to see if we can influence the way these diseases are treated. And ALS is our first clinical data, with MS, multiple sclerosis, and Parkinson's following.
Yeah. Very cool. And for those that know folks afflicted with those diseases, it's a rough one. All three obviously are rough. And I don't know, I couldn't imagine the joy of possibly having a solution for those.
It is in context. So of the three, multiple sclerosis has had the most clinical successes in the pharmaceutical cornucopia, so to speak, over the last number of decades. The MS category, the multiple sclerosis category of prescribed drugs, is now a $23 billion category. Those drugs are almost entirely autoimmune suppressants. So what that means is they basically tamp down our own immune response so our body stops attacking itself. And in multiple sclerosis, that's critical. In MS, the patients attack their own nerves because of this immune response. And if we can stop that attack, then we can stop further damage. But what none of those drugs do is they do not return function that has been lost.
Okay.
And so what Clene's intent is to see if we can return function. And that is also applicable in Parkinson's. The few drugs available in Parkinson's just basically affect symptoms. And in the case of ALS, there's only 2 drugs approved in this country and frankly worldwide. And though everybody's on both of them, or one or both of them, neither really does much to change the course of the disease, unfortunately.
Yeah. All right. So your job as CEO is tricky with these big, long timelines. I imagine the CFO has a lot of different spreadsheets and projections based on outcomes. What's the difference between being a CEO of Clene versus maybe a CEO of a consumer goods or a tech company?
The primary difference is a CEO of a biopharmaceutical needs to have the right blend of clinical expertise or scientific acumen, coupled with a commercialization understanding, how to get a drug to market and through this process, and an ability to raise the extraordinary amount of money that such clinical trials require over many years, as I've noted. Mm-hmm. But also, too, the CEO requires a little bit of a cheerleading capability, as you've sensed, because of the high-risk, high-reward nature of the job, a resilience because in any given way, biology is tricky, and science has proven year in and year out that there's many failures for every success.
Yeah.
And so we have to be pretty enthusiastic about the outcome and work carefully towards helping the patients.
Yeah. And when things get delayed or if certain trials don't work out,
which always happens.
Always happens.
It's inevitable. It's happened multiple times.
So that's in other industries, like, all right, we better pivot, right? And I guess it's different for you guys. How do you handle those setbacks?
So pivoting in biopharmaceutical clinical research is difficult because it's such a multi-year, very expensive process. But one of the ways that Clene is approaching this is you've already heard me speak to 3 diseases that we're attacking at the same time.
Okay.
So our clinical programs are in parallel to each other with one asset. We call it CNMAU8, and that asset we'll find out by the end of this year whether that asset is effective in ALS as a proof of concept. We'll find out at the top of next year whether that asset is approvable in a phase 3 registration study that we can take that data and submit to the FDA. And by the end of next year, we'll find out if that asset is effective in multiple sclerosis. And so any one of those projects could be a big win. All 3 of them would be the brass ring, so to speak.
Yeah.
And so taken together, we've tried to resolve the risk by doing a couple different things at once. And that, speaking to your CEO question, is also tricky because that means there's a number of balls in the air. And much like your hat is probably different every 15 minutes that you wear, a CEO of a biopharmaceutical company is exactly the same, but maybe on steroids, to use a pharmaceutical metaphor.
Yeah. So I guess theoretically, CEOs of pharmaceutical companies might only have like 3 or 4 like big victories over the course of their career, if these timelines are like 10 plus years. Is that accurate?
Yes, I've been exceedingly lucky, even blessed. I spent 9 years at Pfizer, the big pharma company that everyone's heard of, and at the end of my career there, I was one of the team leaders on the Lipitor franchise. So Lipitor is a cholesterol-lowering drug that most people have heard of.
Yeah.
And that enabled me to cut my teeth in kind of the big pharma, multi-resources, tons of money, huge revenue stream, and a drug that basically affected people's lives around the world and that pretty much every prescribing physician in the world has also heard of.
Yeah.
I went from there to a very small startup. I joined that startup in the year we took the company public, and then stayed there for 13 years as the chief commercial officer. That startup is called Etherington. No one's really ever heard of that, but it became the largest biotech in Europe and focused particularly on a rare orphan disease called high blood pressure in the lungs, which is called pulmonary arterial hypertension. That before we got there, most patients either had to go to lung transplant or they passed away. Now, that's a very large multi-billion-dollar drug category with a lot of different drugs that can help that disease. And the company that I was at, Actelion, was purchased by J&J for $30 billion.
Oh.
So it was a fantastic 13 years where we tried to do something audacious, and it worked. And patients who earlier would have either been on a transplant list or pass away, now many of them are living their active lives just like you and I.
Yeah.
And then in the middle of that, or at the end of that journey, I was contacted by a couple investors that had been funding the projects that we are now talking about with Clene. And they persuaded me to come over and see if we could start it again. And an interesting note for our listeners here at Silicon Slopes is I was actually in Palo Alto, California. I'm a California by, I spent 25 years of my life in California and 15 years professionally in the biopharmaceutical sector in Silicon Valley, right in Palo Alto. And we founded Clene in Palo Alto, but for a number of reasons, we decided to move the company here to Utah.
Yeah. There's a pretty good history of bio and pharma in Utah, right?
We have a fantastic diagnostic, a fantastic genetics, and a fantastic device sector. So in terms of healthcare, I would count those 3 super highly, and we cannot discount the extraordinary job we do with University of Utah Health and Intermountain Healthcare, 2 of the best-run healthcare systems in the country. And we also do a fantastic job, and there's been a number of companies succeeding in healthcare analytics or big data applied to healthcare. What there has not historically been in Utah, not a robust infrastructure, is a biopharmaceutical sector, the development of drugs. But that, too, is changing. In fact, Clene took itself public only 7 months ago, and there's been another BioPharma that took itself public in the last few months. And so I think we are right now witnessing the possible beginning of a resurgence of biopharmaceutical drug development here in the state, to leverage our talent base, to leverage our science, to leverage everything that makes Utah great, frankly, our economy, our tax base, the people that are willing to work at these companies and want to live in Utah.
Yeah, very cool. All right, this FDA thing's pretty intriguing because a lot hinges on it, right? And is it like a committee of folks that ultimately decide if it's a green light, red light? How much do you know of the process right at the tail end?
So yes, it's multiple people working in multiple different areas of the FDA that evaluate the asset, or the what's called the new drug application, which is the application that one submits that is a voluminous amount of data from all of this many years of effort. And the new drug application talks about the composition of the drug itself, the clinical data, the patient composition, the toxicity and safety. All of that is evaluated carefully. The process traditionally takes approximately a year. There is an accelerated review that is possible, which we've just witnessed with Pfizer's vaccine approval that happened this week. And one can get what's called orphan drug status for rare orphan diseases. And one can also get breakthrough status for major breakthroughs that change fundamentally the way the game is played, or the way diseases are treated. Clene already has orphan drug status for its asset. And if our program concluding in a few months is also successful, we'll apply for breakthrough as well. And to your question of the FDA, then there's a series of experts that are long-term career savvy regulators that run arguably one of the best healthcare regulatory bodies in the world, if not the best, categorically. And they evaluate all this data and then they decide. Occasionally, to your question of a committee, they also work with outside consultants that are clinicians and experts in the diseases we're speaking of, in the drug categories we're talking about. And those advisors may advise the FDA as to what they would do. And the FDA takes all of that advice, plus their own analysis, into consideration.
Wow. Yeah, that's pretty intense. So you send the application or the packet. I assume you can't call them and lobby? Or,
you cannot. You send it and you wait. You send it and you wait. So you wait for the 6 to 12 months, and then the agency comes back to you and they say, either we need more data, this is a bad idea and we're not going to proceed, or congratulations, let's get this drug commercialized so patients can benefit.
Okay.
And so that's why, again, the process is high risk, high reward, and why one must be pretty classically drilled into the different steps. Back to your question earlier about pharmaceutical drug development is not for the faint-hearted. You need to be pretty aware, drilled into, and have a whole team of experts behind me, the CEO, to basically work through this process. And so there's a chief medical officer, there's pharmacologists, in our case, there's a physicist and material science experts, there are electrical engineers experts that help manufacture, there's drug developers, there's clinicians, and so forth and so on.
Yeah. So you got to be a CEO of a profitable company and really understand bureaucracy and regulations as well at the same time.
Yes. Now, the profitable piece, that's, of course, based upon the thesis that the FDA approves the drug and you can start having physicians prescribe it and insurance companies reimburse it.
Yeah.
So we haven't even got to that piece yet, but that's soon coming to Clene. If we are successful in these various programs in ALS, multiple sclerosis, and Parkinson's, if we can demonstrate that we're the first drug asset ever to improve neurological function, which is the way our muscles work and talk to our brain, then that data, if commercialized, we think it'll be the advent of a whole new approach to treating these diseases. But we have to get physicians to understand. We have to teach the physicians how to learn about novel new mechanisms, and we have to get the insurance companies to be aligned to pay for the patients to be on the drug.
Yeah. It's pretty intense. When I was in 6th grade or 7th grade, I had to get a physical to play football, and just in the doctor's office, and there was, I think, a pharma salesman leaving the doctor's office, if memory serves, and the doctors said, "Yeah, that is talking about a pill, but it doesn't mean anything to you at this point, but it's called Viagra." And the doctor was pretty crass. He's like, "It's going to be pretty big, right, with the commercialization." So he's like, "Yeah, I don't know if you invest, but Pfizer." Okay, cool. And so that obviously worked well and probably made a lot of money. But at some point, people get to replicate it, right? That particular pill in this example. Does that apply for these types of things that you're working on? Like, is there a sunset period?
So Viagra and all of us prepare our patents that give a certain amount of exclusivity.
Okay.
And clinical drug developers can take that same mechanism of action and tweak it and try to develop a different approach using the same basic mechanism.
Okay.
So how the drug works in the body to do what it's supposed to do. And that was the case with Viagra. There was a number of drugs like Viagra that were developed.
Yeah.
Usually there is a huge first mover advantage in all the space. And so you talked about a drug that most people know about. But in the Lipitor example that I used earlier, there is multiple statins, as they're called. The statin is a drug class. It's the way it works to lower cholesterol. Lipitor was categorically not the first entrant. In fact, it was near the end of the number of drugs. And so there's a piece of Me Tooism where you try to do something better. And in our case, that'll be pretty difficult to replicate, we think. The way we do this, we not only have patented, but we keep a number of trade secrets separate only to Clene, locked in a vault, as it were, with the recipe.
Yeah.
And we also are trying to stay a step ahead of the competition in the way we approach these diseases mechanistically, the way our drug works.
Yeah.
And we also do all of our own manufacturing, which is unusual for a company like ours.
Yeah.
Most pharmaceutical companies out-license a lot of that stuff, and Clene has decided, since it's the key IP, the key intellectual property, to keep this in-house.
Gotcha. Well, I could keep asking you questions all day, and this is really fun to learn about this industry and what it's like to be the CEO of a company that has all of these hurdles. And it's probably pretty rewarding at the end of the day to have these victories. So over the next couple of years, it'll be kind of telling as to what you guys do after that, right?
Yeah. So the key timeline for Clene is we will literally find out by the end of the year,
okay,
as I've mentioned, whether our drug, CNM-Au8, taken orally by mouth, can stop decline in ALS patients, the way the muscles work, and or improve that ability. So it would be a great victory, because a typical ALS patient loses about 40 to 50% of their muscle function in the first year.
Oh. The
average ALS patient passes away in 3 to 5 years. It's a devastating, extraordinarily horrible diagnosis for any family to receive, that a loved one has ALS. And so if Clene is successful and able to stabilize a patient, or better yet, improve their muscle and pulmonary lung function, that would be just extraordinary. And we'll find out that data by the end of the year. Then the second study, which is much larger, and as I mentioned, the phase 3 registration study, we're in the enviable position that concludes only 6 months later. So by the first half of next year, we'll find out if we have enough data to take to the FDA. And to your point, if that is successful and we can bring a drug to market that can affect the muscles, the pulmonary function of the way these people, these patients, these people with ALS live their lives, and the way that they can't do everything that you and I take for granted, move and walk and talk and eat and chew and breathe. Those are all fundamental facts of life that you and I don't even think about.
Right.
An ALS patient loses these, and they lose them in front of their eyes.
Yeah.
And so if we can return that function, it would be a great blessing to the patients, and Clene's looking forward to seeing our data to see if we can help.
Yeah, that's exciting, and I've learned a lot. Really appreciate taking the time, Rob, and best of luck to you and your team.
Thank you, Garrett. Thank you for asking about Clene. It's a pleasure.
You bet.